Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Fred and Leslie Mueller? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. I'll start with the background of this case, move to the timeline of the alleged crime, then offer my analysis. Fred and Leslie Mueller lived in San Angelo, Texas. They married when Fred was 19 and Leslie was 20. They went on to have 3 children, Amanda, Ariel, and Alex. The couple was wealthy. Fred owned a company that imported steel for construction, and Leslie was an OB/GYN. In 2004, Leslie retired to focus on other interests. She spent more time in church and studied theology. She was Roman Catholic. The Mueller family spent time at a vacation home in Lake City, Colorado, where they would engage in outdoor activities like riding horses. On May 3, 2008, Fred, Leslie, and their 14-year-old son, Alex, were at this vacation home. At this point, Fred and Leslie were married for almost 27 years. After they went to Mass in town, Fred and Leslie suggested to Alex that they all finish the day with a hike to some waterfalls in nearby Cottonwood Creek. They wanted to do this in order to take some photographs. Alex was tired at this point and turned down the invitation. Fred and Leslie took their border collie named Gracie and drove to the base of the trail. They started hiking toward the waterfalls. There was some patchy snow on the ground, but generally it was fairly easy to navigate the area. They continued past several waterfalls before reaching one that they found to be ideal. Fred posed for photographs, and then it was Leslie's turn. Here's what happened next, according to Fred. Leslie was posing with Gracie for a photograph in front of the waterfall. Just after Fred snapped the picture at 6:10 p.m., a bluebird of some type swept in and startled the dog. Leslie reacted to the dog's reaction by falling down the embankment into a rock before sliding into Cottonwood Creek. She was swept downstream and went out of view. After searching for her unsuccessfully, Fred climbed in his vehicle and drove about 1.8 miles to the nearest house. He arrived there 28 minutes after taking the last picture and made contact with the owner of the house, who was a man named Justin Sparks. Fred told Justin that his wife fell into the creek and he couldn't find her. Justin called 911, and then he offered to help Fred find his wife. The two of them drove up the mountain in Fred's vehicle. Fred dropped Justin off at a place to start searching. As Fred continued driving, he encountered a physician's assistant and EMS volunteer named Michael Golub. Michael had heard the call over the radio about a female drowning victim. Fred picked up Michael, and the two started searching for Leslie. Michael noticed that Fred had scratches on his face. Fred could not seem to find the area where Leslie fell into the creek. He stopped once and Michael started to exit. Fred said, "No, this isn't it." The men continued driving. When they stopped again, they heard Justin Sparks yelling. He found Leslie in the creek about 150 feet from where Fred claimed she fell in. Her body was pinned under a log in the creek. She did not survive. From the creek embankment, Fred asked the question, "Is she dead?" Eventually, the police and other first responders arrived. After some time, they found the border collie, Gracie. The dog was unharmed. The police questioned Fred about what happened. He told them the story about this blue bird startling the dog. He said that Leslie looked like she did a swan dive over the edge and slammed into a rock with her head and shoulders. She was then swept away by the creek. Fred stood on the embankment and screamed her name. He ran up and down the embankment looking for her. He scratched his face as he navigated through the bushes. Unable to find her, he went looking for help. The police became suspicious of Fred, and they believed he may have been involved in his wife's death. Some evidence suggested a struggle may have taken place, and there were gaps in Fred's story. 10 months after Leslie's death, the police interviewed Fred for a second time. Fred offered the same explanation for what happened to Leslie. Fred continued on with his life. In 2010, he married a woman named Wendy. In 2011, a new district attorney took office. On February 6, 2012, Fred was arrested and charged with murder. He remained in jail through his trial, which started in January 2013. The jury deliberated for 4 days, but could not come to a unanimous decision. 11 jurors believed he was not guilty, and 1 juror believed he was guilty. A mistrial was declared. The judge determined that the prosecution did not have enough evidence to establish premeditation. Therefore, the most serious charge against Fred, first-degree murder, was dismissed. He was still facing a second-degree murder charge. Fred was released on bond. His second trial started in the fall of 2013. Once again, the jury was deadlocked. This time, 8 voted guilty and 4 voted not guilty. The state decided not to try Fred for a third time. This case technically remains open. If new evidence is discovered, Fred could be charged again, so he has the sword of Damocles dangling above his head. Now moving to my analysis. Even though both of Fred's trials resulted in a mistrial, was he actually guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Fred was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Fred was the only person with Leslie when she died. They just happened to be taking pictures at the edge of a cliff. It seems unusual that Fred couldn't find Leslie's body, even though it was only 150 feet away from where she allegedly fell in. Fred had someone else call 911 and never personally talked to emergency services on the phone. The distance from the edge of the cliff to the rock that Leslie supposedly hit was 19 feet, yet the only injury she had on her body was a contusion on her forehead. There was no forensic evidence that Leslie ever made contact with the rock. The injury on her head was not severe enough so that she would have been rendered unconscious, at least according to some of the experts. Most people don't fly over the edge of a cliff when their dog is startled by a bird. Based on the condition of the creek at the time, it is highly unlikely that Leslie's body floated 150 feet downstream. The water in the creek wasn't that deep, and it was not flowing quickly. Fred had scratches on his face. The scratches were vertical and parallel to one another. They were 1/8 inch wide and positioned 1/8 inch apart. Leslie was wearing gloves that had little plastic bumps on them, which could have caused the scratches on Fred's face. Fred offered 3 different explanations for how the scratches came to be on his face. 1, running through bushes, which is interesting considering the scratches were vertical. 2, climbing out of the creek. I guess he was practicing the little-known face climbing technique. And 3, Fred said that he may have self-mutilated. Fred claimed that he fell on a gravel road 6 or 7 times trying to make his way back to his vehicle, yet he only had scratches on the back of one of his hands. There were signs of a struggle in the mud and snow near the area where Leslie supposedly went off the cliff. A pair of broken glasses were found 15 feet from this area. They belonged to Fred. Fred dropped Justin off at the wrong place to look for his wife, and initially drove to the wrong place when Michael was in his vehicle, as if Fred was stalling. Justin Sparks said that Fred Mueller's behavior did not match the circumstances. Fred was alternating between frantic and calm. When the police initially interviewed Fred, he exhibited a lack of emotion. He became defensive and spontaneously offered information on topics without being asked. He told the police that he had sex with his wife that morning. He spontaneously mentioned how he and his wife had insurance policies, but it was just for inheritance. He suggested there was no monetary benefit in killing his wife. Fred said that he did not have a girlfriend, and he and his wife loved each other. He had no reason to kill her. At one point, Fred threatened a police officer who was asking him questions by saying, "If you didn't have a badge and a gun, I'd blank beat the blank out of you." I find it interesting that Fred became verbally aggressive, especially considering he was accused of losing control in a matter of seconds. Like that verbally aggressive behavior could be consistent with homicide in the heat of the moment. One witness said that Fred told her his marriage had gone stale. Fred also allegedly said that he would never go through a divorce because no woman would dictate to him when he was going to see his kids. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Michael, the EMS volunteer, said that he didn't see anything unusual about Fred's behavior considering the circumstances. Many people indicated that Fred was a kind and loving husband. It doesn't make sense that he would turn into a killer in a matter of seconds. There were no defensive wounds on Leslie's body. No physical evidence ties Fred to the area where Leslie's body was recovered, like there were no footprints or anything like that. Fred's confusing narrative after the incident may have been caused by stress. A canine expert testified about the last photograph that was taken of Leslie and the border collie, Gracie. The expert indicated that Gracie looked like she was spooked and ready to bolt. I think a good sign that a criminal prosecution has gone off the rails is when the state tries to extract testimony from dogs. I could picture one prosecutor asking another, "Do you think we can get an expert in here to read this dog's mind?" If the answer to that question is yes, then even calling Scooby-Doo to the stand will not save the case. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I think that Fred Mueller was guilty? I think he was guilty in reality, but not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I think Fred probably killed his wife. If he did do it, it was done in the heat of the moment. It was not premeditated. The case against Fred was not good because of the many mistakes made by investigators. The poor investigation resulted in too many unanswered questions and left room for reasonable doubt. Also, the jury did not visit the creek during either trial. This area of Cottonwood Creek is fairly small. It's quite constricted, and I think that if they could have seen it, they would have realized that a body traveling 150 feet downstream was unrealistic. In the courtroom, it may have looked like the area was much larger. At least that's what prosecutors believed. Now moving to my final thoughts. One of the most confusing parts of this case for those who believe that Fred is guilty is the sudden change in behavior that would have been necessary to commit this murder. Fred was described as a loving and devoted husband. People said that he and his wife had a deal where they would never go to bed angry. I wonder if this philosophy could have had something to do with the alleged homicidal attack. The idea of never going to bed angry is embraced by many couples. It usually remains intact for a few months, or maybe even a few years, but then it is abandoned because it's unrealistic. Married couples argue for a variety of good and bad reasons. To put a limit on how long a spouse can remain upset denies the nature of emotions. It's an artificial rule that is not connected to how people progress through various feelings. Couples who artificially terminate arguments at night never fully address the circumstances and feelings involved in the argument. There is no true resolution. It forces them to find other ways to cope with their feelings, some of which may be unhealthy, and it facilitates resentment. Maybe that's what happened in this case. Maybe Fred did not have a way to express his emotions. He was too busy trying to maintain this disingenuous peace between him and his wife. Perhaps all of his emotions exploded in one homicidal instance. But at least he did not go to bed angry. Those are my thoughts in the case of Fred and Leslie Mueller. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic as intriguing as an expert who can read the minds of dogs. Thanks for watching.